Hi everyone, Stepan here. We're going to continue the series on the English with the Nimzo-English. And this is something a Nimzo-Indian player would play against the English opening because that's the position they're trying to reach in the normal d4, c4 systems. And the Nimzo-Indian defense, as you know, starts with pawn to d4, knight f6, pawn c4, e6, and now if white allows the Nimzo with knight c3, then black plays bishop to b4. However, we're going to be looking at the same position, but without the pawn on d4. We're going to have a knight on f3 instead. So we start with the English. Black plays knight f6, we go knight c3, or black plays e6 on move 1, it doesn't matter, it can transpose. And then we go knight f3. Now in the previous video we've looked at pawn to e4, which is the Mykonos attack or the Mykonos-Karls variation. And you can see that in the previous video. That's a nice alternative to avoid all the complication you can get with the Nimzo-English, or if you play knight f3 here, if black doesn't play the Nimzo-English, with the Mykonos attack you're also avoiding d5 lines. Okay, one thing I should say is that if at any point during the opening you play d4, you have just transposed to the normal English or the Queen's Indian if they decide to go b6 at some point. And also, if you would like to avoid this altogether after one knight f6, you can simply go pawn to g3, which doesn't allow bishop b4 because there's nothing on c3 and it's not with check. So after e6, bishop g2, black cannot play the Nimzo/Bogo move bishop b4 because that would be a simple tempo gain for white with a3. There is nothing to take. So if you would like to avoid the Nimzo-English altogether, g3 systems avoid that. Okay, and we're going to be looking at several options for white in the Nimzo-English. So after knight f3, bishop to b4, the main idea white has is to defend the knight, and you basically don't want to double your pawns on the d file. So white's main idea is queen to c2 followed by a3, or queen to b3 followed by a3, which we're going to look at in the last part of this video. There are some differences because the queen on b3 attacks the bishop straight away. So if black takes on c3 voluntarily, you haven't wasted the tempo on a3, which may or may not be useful. Now, what's the point of avoiding d4? Well, if you're a c4 player, then you may want to go for a light squared strategy with g3 later on. You may want to play a sort of Reti system, a quiet position with d3 and e3. So that's the first point. The second point of this is that by not having a pawn on d4, you're playing for the dark squares, which is extremely strange in the Nimzo-Indian. In the Nimzo-Indian, usually the fight is about this diagonal alone, and in particular the e4 square. And the move bishop b4 by black aims to control the e4 square. So the fight in the normal Nimzo is going to be around the light squares. By keeping our pawn on d2, as white, we have the option to play the move d3, controlling e4, and then going for a dark squared strategy on the a1, h8 diagonal. So maybe in the future, we will be able to line up our queen and bishop on this diagonal, especially since we may be able to use the tempo on this bishop on b4 with a3, b4, thus giving ourselves the option to go bishop b2, and if our queen is on c2 later on, simply queen c3, trying to put pressure on the black king. So that's one of the main ideas for white. And the downside, of course, is since we don't have a pawn on d4, black is going to have the option to gain more space in the center. Now, what I think is the most frightening setup black can play is a setup with d6 and later on e5, which simply blunts this diagonal and doesn't allow you to have any significant advantage because of the control of the e4 square. So black can play the normal Bogo Indian fashion with knight c6 and d6 and e5, give this bishop up, and simply say that since the pawns are on dark squares, since black has such amazing control of the dark squares in the center, there is no problem at all. And then later on, since we don't have a pawn on d4, black's fianchetto option on the queen side could mean that we have some problems on the a8 h1 diagonal. So the main decision you will have to make is whether you want to meet b6 bishop b7 with g3 bishop g2 or not. If you do, then your bishop isn't going to be as powerful a defender of the queen side along the f1 a6 diagonal, but it is going to be challenging the bishop on b7, and your bishop, which alternatively goes to e2, isn't going to have an influence on the king side either. So that being said, let's get into the variations. Now, I would like to start with the main line because it's the main line, and in this position queen c2 makes the most sense. Now, black has several options against this. Taking the knight straight away is possible, but isn't really necessary before provoked. So as I said, black has several options. d5 is going to be, in my opinion, inferior for black, because after let me show you. Well, let's go through the sidelines first. d5 is a possible setup, so we just go a3. And of course, black could retreat the bishop to e7, but that wouldn't be good in most cases. If bishop e7, then we can simply follow that up with d4, and now we have a favorable queen's gambit position where we just have a pawn on a3, which may not seem like a useful move, but in many positions, if black chooses to go c5, we are ready to undermine the center from both sides. So after, for example, castles and bishop f4 and c6, you can see that black is playing a regular Semislav pawn triangle, but we have an extra tempo. After something like e3, there is no way black can equalize. So after d5, a3, usually what should happen is black should take on c3, and after queen takes c3, again, I don't think black has anything very good in this position. After castles, e3, something like b6, b4, black is going to claim the light square diagonal, we are going to claim the dark square diagonal, and in this position dc4 is possible, knight bd7 is possible. I prefer white here, but it's possible for black to play d5 and sort of clarify the position in the center very early in this position. So d5 against the main line, I don't think is black's best attempt for an advantage. Now what I really do like, which can be played via different move orders, is the idea of going d6, e5, and black could go d6 straight away, and it's simply playing against your plan of using this diagonal efficiently. And if I were black and I played the Nimzo-English, I would do this, because usually Nimzo-Indian players are familiar with setups where there's a knight on c6 and a pawn on e5, and Bogo Indian players as well. So a3, again, bishop c3, when the pawn is on d6, there is no other option. So takes, queen takes, e5, b4, castles, bishop b2. Now this is what worries me as white. And of course, black can start undermining this advanced pawn chain with a5 at any point. Black could go knight c6 or knight b to d7. Black could simply wait with rook e8. And after something like e3, black could continue bishop g4 maybe, bishop e2, knight bd7. Again, very, very solid setup for black. And with this pawn chain, black is trying to say that your diagonal is useless. The light squares are under black's control for the moment, and white is going to have to play d3 at some point. And after something like knight f8, h3, maybe bishop h5, black should be about equal. So this is the part I don't like. However, if you manage to open up the center later on, so you castle, bring your rooks to the center, maybe advance with d4 and break open this pawn structure, or even just continue playing on the queen side with c5 without preparation, you could cause significant weaknesses. So imagine a position in which white goes c5 and that's not taken. That gives white the semi-open c file, and pressure on c7, which may not be enough. And if it's taken, then semi-open c-file again, pressure on c7. I think it's equal, but white should have better chances because of the bishop pair later on in the game. And both positions are perfectly solid. Okay, then against queen c2, black can also just play b6, which honestly I think is the best idea. You're just saying, okay, you're gonna claim the dark square diagonal, I'm going to claim the light square diagonal, and let's see what happens. So again, a3, bishop takes, queen takes, bishop b7, b4, same sort of idea. d6, bishop b2, knight bd7, and when there's a bishop on b7, black does not play knight c6, black plays knight bd7. And now again, you have the option I was talking about. You can, and move orders don't really matter here. You can play g3 or you can play e3. If you want to go g3, that means that in a position after e5, there's going to be tension along this diagonal, and you're going to give up the bishop pair most likely at some point by trading these two bishops, thus giving your main advantage when it comes to imbalances. So I prefer the move e3. And after something like castles, bishop e2, we have now transposed to many well-known positions after c5, where black is playing a sort of hedgehog setup without a6. So, for example, rook c8, and here again d3 or d4 can be played. I prefer d3, and maybe queen e7. And one main theme, which we are going to be looking at in the main lines too, where black simply plays c5 or castles against queen c2, is this undermining of the queen side. And when black has a fianchetto and you don't, then it means that this bishop on b7, even though unopposed, is sort of in the way of black defending the queen side. So what we can try to do after, let's say, e5, we can try to go a4. And now black has to be careful. If white plays a5, that's going to mean that white has a significant edge in any endgame, either with an isolated a7 pawn or the a7 square as an infiltration point for the rook, or even maybe after a6, this pawn that could be a target. So for example, if black plays nothing, then we push with a5. If taken, this is a significant weakness, and eventually white should be winning this endgame, I think. If it's not taken, let's say again black does nothing, then we can choose between two pleasant options, a6 and ab. And if something like this should happen, it's obvious that white is better. So against a4, black really has to play a5, I think. I don't think there's any other option. And after ba, bishop a, we now again have a pleasant position because we have a target and black doesn't. It's really hard to get to the a pawn. Something like queen b3 immediately seems annoying. Rook b8, maybe knight d2, maybe this knight can transfer to the b5 square at some point, which means that the bishop is tied down. We're increasing control over the light squares. We're inviting this bishop to come back to the diagonal to be traded off. So, in my opinion, this idea of undermining the queen side is what makes this position very powerful for white. So coming back, the key move is at some point against this setup to play the move b5, and then a4, a5 becomes a significant threat. Okay, now the alternative to black playing b6, d6 or d5 is either castles or c5, which we will consider the main lines. If castles, black can play c5 later on. If c5 first, then black can castle later on. So we're going to be looking at similar positions. Now, when they play c5, and they don't take on c3, because that's one of the ideas of c5. It's preparing an escape square for the bishop in some positions. So maybe after a3, they can go bishop a5. Again, if they go bishop takes c3, we are going to transpose, and likely they're going to play a position with b6. So it's going to be similar to what we just saw. So the difference is bishop a5. And what I would recommend against this setup alone is to play for d4 as quickly as possible. Why? Well, because this bishop wasted a couple of moves. And if we manage to play d4 and b4, then we are going to be breaking through that center very quickly. So there are two options. Either go for a quick d4 with e3, or play g3 and play a light squared strategy, because it's not really possible to go b6 and challenge the light squares when the bishop is on a5, unless black takes on c3 at some point and, well, tries to do that. So if we go g3, you will see that black is basically forced to take on c3 at some point, which is why I cannot really decide what to make my main line repertoire against the Nimzo-English in this position, e3 or g3. So again, we were looking at the main line with c5, a3, bishop a5, and now e3 or g3. Let's look at g3 first. So they go knight c6, for example. There are alternatives. Bishop to g2, castles, d6. Black tries to play the main thing, and notice how b6 would sort of leave this bishop stranded on a5. So after d3, for example, h6 can be played, let's say preventing bishop to g5 or knight g5, and e3, e5. Okay, very standard. And now we can start controlling the light squares. And this idea of going knight d2 is very interesting, because you increase control over the entire light squared complex at once. And white can do nothing about that. White can play bishop f5, and and continue developing their pieces. But usually, in light of white's light squared control, black is going to give up this bishop to increase control over the light squares, and then go a5 to prevent b4. And what black is trying to do is limit the scope of this bishop and increase light squared control. So you can see that the bishop retreated and then took on c3, which has to be slightly favorable for us. So after something like b3, bishop e6, bishop b2, all we have to do is somehow make d4 work at some point, and then this is going to be a huge strength. So I like g3. Alternatively, we could also go e3, and this is more straightforward. So castles, bishop e2, knight c6, castles, d6, and now d4, we're ready. And it's not really useful for black to take this pawn, increasing our central control, giving us the option to go c5 or d5 or b4. This just gives up the b4 square, so taking would mean that white has a monstrous position, for example, like this. Let's say queen e7, and obviously this is a major weakness in the black position. And of course e5 can be played at some point, but there is just too much pressure, and you don't really want to give up the d5 square if you don't have to. So most people are not going to take on d4. So they go something like queen e7, trying to play for e5. Rook d1, bishop takes, again trying to limit the scope of your knight that could go to d5 in many positions after e5. And now e5. Okay, and what I would recommend here is that you play d5, try and chase this knight away, and the knight is usually going to go to b8 and then back to d7. Even though it's not possible to go to c5, black is going to try to read out the knight back into the game this way. And this is going to be very similar to some check Benoni positions after, for example, e4, where white has a ton of space and both sides have the same pawn breaks, f4, f5, b4, b5. But notice how our a3 pawn is actually useful for that plan. I should also mention that this knight can read out to f1 and e3 later on to put significant pressure on the f5 square. And in my opinion, if black goes for this close type of position, if white is at all familiar with how to play closed Benoni positions, then white should be better. But remember again that this is your bad bishop and this is their good bishop. Your pawns are on light squares, their pawns are on dark squares. So if you can trade these two bishops off somehow, that should be strategically very advantageous for white in the long run. Of course, short term, if black is allowed f5 quickly or something else, then black is fine. Okay, that's c5. Again, if they go c5, you will probably see bishop a5 as a follow-up. However, if they castle and you go a3, they're going to take. So takes. Now again, several positions to choose from, either b6 or d6. I think the best way for black to play is with b6 or with d6, e5, knight c6, the setup we already saw. So let's say they go b6 as an alternative. Now, again, this is a major crossroads in the position where you can choose between several different setups. g3 is the main alternative to what I'm about to show you, and g3 just aims to dampen the influence of the bishop on b7 and the potential of this diagonal for black. It is possible to do that. I don't think it's necessary though. I think the best way to play against this, because c5 is coming at some point, you know that black is going to go d6, c5 and so on. I like going for that undermining of the queen side, and we can reach that same position via transposition. So b4, we're prepared to go b5 at some point once c5 is played. So bishop b7, bishop b2, d6, e3, same position, knight bd7, bishop e2, and c5. Okay, castles. Now I shouldn't really point out that taking on b4 would give white an open a file, semi-open a file, and a better central control with a weakness on d6 we could target later on. So if something like this happens and the knight goes away, we may even play b5 simply to give us a way to target d6 once we're not giving up the c5 square. So that's never really going to be an option. Black usually continues rook c8, and now again we play d4. We want to weaken black's center, and again this should not be taken either way because it increases our central control. There are some tricky positions here with knight e4 where black can try to harass our queen. So the alternative to this, to playing d4, is d3, which I think if you understand that queenside pressure strategy, go for this. Again, if they go queen e7, we have just transposed b5 and e5, a4. This is our idea. So if you play d3, you want to close the position down with b5. And of course, black will have to be playing for either d5 or e4 at some point, and we are playing for a5. I think our threat is more significant, but of course the position is playable for both sides. One thing we should mention is that if this pawn ever disappears and it gets weakened with d5, it moves away with e5, then tactically black has to be extremely careful. Okay, so our main line with queen c2 is fairly logical, preparing to take on c3 and in most cases trying to occupy this diagonal and trying to control e4 with the d3 pawn. The main choice is going to be whether we challenge the diagonal with g3 bishop g2 or not. That's your choice to make. I still haven't decided. Okay, I'm going to prepare for each game separately when I prepare the English during tournaments, and I'll see what my opponents play. That's the only thing I can do. Okay, now let's have a look at g3 as a fianchetto setup, which is the alternative to playing queen c2. I don't know. If you play queen c2 at some point, you will likely transpose to the main lines, but if you don't, then they can take. And I don't like that. I don't like having doubled pawns if I don't have to. For example, black castles, we go bishop g2, black goes d5, a3, and now either bishop takes c3 or bishop e7. I think this position is good for black. Something like knight bd7, cd5, ed5, castles, and rook e8. I don't think this bishop is good enough for you to say, I have the bishop pair, I'm better. For example, queen c2, queen e7, I like black's position. The development is extremely natural, and I don't like the weakness on b3 and c4. Maybe in the future black is going to be able to use that in an endgame. I really dislike the fact that white has a3 on the board. If I could put this pawn back on a2, I would be happy with white's position, and this would resemble a lot of Tarrasch French positions, which I'm used to playing, where this usually the pawn on d5 is isolated. But there's a hole for white on e4 and a blockading square on d4 in the Tarrasch, and you don't want a pawn on a3. Now, if black doesn't castle, what I think black should do is, well, look at what you're doing and just challenge you. So b6 and bishop b2, bishop b7. Now both sides castle. Something like queen c2 and d5 should be a position in which black is trying to play the normal queen's gambit with the bishop on b4. And cd, ed, d4. This is going to resemble many main lines where both bishops are kind of bad, kind of blocked in. But the good news for white is that the g2 bishop is blocked by a black pawn, so at least white has a target. So in short, I don't think g3 should be the move you choose. As I said before, if you like playing g3 positions, just go g3 on move 2 and avoid all the complications with the Nimzo-Indian. That's my advice. Now let's have a look at my favorite position of all, and this is probably what I'll be playing in most of my Nimzo-English games, and that's the Zvjaginsev attack, or the Zvjaginsev-Krasenkow attack. Some people call it the Shirov-English. I've heard that twice, and I have no idea why they call it that, other than the fact that Shirov plays g4 all the time, or used to play. But it's similar to what happens in the Slav and the semi-Slav. It's g4. And, well, let's look at the obvious move first. What if black takes? The idea is the same as in the semi-Slav. You go rook g1. However, it's even less favorable here because you haven't wasted the tempo on d4. And you have other options later on. If the knight should retreat, then you just take on g7. If black tries to defend with f5, then you just go h3, and this of course is an overwhelming advantage for white. Black isn't going to castle anywhere, white isn't going to castle anywhere, but we have a rook on the 7th rank. So the pawn really should not be taken, because white just gets the pawn back with initiative. So there are two main moves, either castles or h6. I think castles isn't that good, because since we started the kingside attack, it makes way more sense to continue the attack once the king has committed. So from a human perspective, I'm not a big fan of castles here, because we as white just go g5, and after knight e8, h4. It's very simple chess. You want to push your pawn all the way to h6 or to g6, depending on what black does, create some weaknesses, and then continue from there. Very natural position. Black isn't losing or anything, this is still theory, and black can fight in the center with d5. We go, for example, queen b3, c5, cd, ed, queen takes is a possibility. However, if you don't want to do that against d5, it is possible to just continue pushing your pawns and give up the entire center. You have to be slightly scared of d4. I would advise you to look at some games from this position. Now, most of them were draws. There is an interesting game which I like a lot, which I analyzed. Boris Savchenko versus Harika Dronavali. Let me insert this game here. Okay, so the game went queen b6, queen b3, c5, c takes d5, and then knight d6 by Harika. And after a3, bishop a5, d3, ed, queen d, bishop e6 was played, and white took the pawn on c5. And as you're going to see, white ended up fianchettoing the bishop and changing the strategy a bit, and black ended up playing f6 at some point so fg5 happened, and it was an extremely interesting game. Now, when you play this gambit or this attack, you don't have to go for a mad kingside attack. You can combine it, as happened in this game by Boris Savchenko, with central control as well. This was played in the 2012 Aeroflot tournament. Okay, but let's have a look at the main line. h6 makes most sense, as in the semi-Slav, simply preventing g5. Now, we could go h4, but I prefer the move rook g1. And now black needs to continue. I mean, black needs to develop some pieces. You could argue that this is a weakness, and I definitely think it is. However, if the king goes to the king side, then it's definitely a strength. So we have a rook on the g file. In compensation for that, we're saying that black can never castle king side. I think that's good enough. Okay, b6, queen c2. So it's basically the main line position, but the difference is that we've inserted these moves, and we're a tempo down on the main line because we wasted a move on rook g1. So main line move tempo up for black, what we have a pawn on g4 and rook on g1. Okay, bishop b7, and now we continue in the normal fashion. a3, bishop c3, queen c3, d6. Again, both sides do their normal stuff. However, this diagonal is going to be even weaker later on. So black is going to have to play f5 to kind of break our control. Now let's look at h4, which is a move that hasn't been played often. Only 6 games. There are alternatives. You can go d4 or bishop g2, but I like h4. e5, blunting the queen, g5, normal, h takes, knight e4. The queen has to go somewhere. Queen e3 is the usual way to defend the pawn. There is no other way. Something like queen e7 and now b4, and we're preparing to put the bishop down this diagonal. And that's at this point where I think if black doesn't play f5, it's not really clear what black does. Now, you can play knight bd7 first and recapture on f5 with either knight, but usually people play f5 straight away and take with the queen or with the knight. That's possible. And now something like d4, knight bd7. I prefer white in this position. There's a weakness on g7, and we have the g5 square. And long term, if you could imagine, well, let me tell you what the engine says. The engine says equal. But here's a plan I found, which worked against me. I played this against the engine level 3 or 4, I don't remember, on Lichess. When I get an interesting position and an attacking idea, I try to make it work against a weaker engine, and then I move on up. So I actually won the game with the move d5 here. And my idea was simply, at some point, knight g5, knight e6. And if black has to go knight f8 before I played knight g5, then that's clearly good for me. And if I go knight g5 and they go knight f8, I don't have to go knight e6. My knight is still good on g5, whereas the knight on f8 is sort of stuck, disconnecting the rooks. And this was the idea that won me the game. I ended up having a ton of pressure on the black position, and black actually castled queenside, and I went a4, a5, broke the position, and ended up taking on g7 as well in the end. So this is an idea I like. There are many positions you can try and study from here. No more theory. You have to figure out stuff on your own. But yeah, I think I'll mostly be playing g4 against the Nimzo-English because it's very straightforward, and I don't see how g4 could be a major weakness for white. Alright, and finally, very briefly, I would like to show you the move queen b3, which is an alternative to queen c2. Now, of course, the idea is, well, let's gain tempo on the bishop, and if the bishop takes, we are transposing to the main lines without a3, which you could say is favorable for white because a3, as we saw in many positions, was a weakness. And if this happens, white slightly changes strategy to a light squared strategy. Since you don't have that much, since you don't have a reason to go b4, and you don't have this expansion because you haven't played a3, I think this is a good idea. Just challenging the light squares straight away, and just going for your normal setup with d3, and if black plays c5, you continue from there. You could still, of course, go a3, b4, but it does not come with tempo. You used your tempo up with queen b3. That being said, bishop pair, very pleasant position, no weakness on a3, should be easy to play for white. Now alternatives are defending the bishop, and black can go c5, well, c5, a5, or knight c6. Those are all playable. I think I like knight c6 the best because it plays in the standard, very standard Bogo-Indian fashion of going for e5 at some point, and this knight is extremely useful. Against this we go a3, and now we are going to transpose to normal lines where black plays knight c6, so you can just watch the first part of the video. It doesn't matter where you take from, if you take from queen c2 or queen b3. So again, I think this is the way to play. The difference is that here black has time for a5 because the knight has been developed straight away, so you're sort of preventing b4. So that's one advantage of starting with knight c6, as is the case in the previous positions as well. Now a5 is a Bogo-Indian idea where either a5 or c5 are played to defend the bishop. And again, we go a3, bishop takes, queen takes, castles, and a5 again plays against b4, which I think is useful. So white plays b3 instead, d6, bishop b2, and e5. This isn't going to be very different to our main line, apart from the fact that black has this pawn on a5, which can be useful because there is a Bogo plan of getting the knight into c5, and this pawn on a5, it helps with that. The knight can also come from c5 to c5 this way. And I'm not saying that's entirely possible immediately, but it is possible. Something like e3 and c5 is what they usually do, and then follow up with knight c6. But it is possible to delay c5 and try to play for getting the knight into c5. Again, I don't think there's too much trouble for white in these positions. We have the bishop pair. If we can play d4, we're going to be better, and we're going to leave a weakness on d6 and have major pressure on g7. And finally, c5 will probably lead to the main lines, except we have a queen on b3, which is unfortunate. So at some point we're going to waste the tempo on queen c2, and this is the reason I don't like queen b3 at all. I don't think it should be played, because in this position after a3, remember how black could retreat to a5 in the main line? Well, black retreats to a5 here, and unfortunately we can never expand with b4 or play b3, so our queen is going to have to move. So e3, again g3 is possible, castles, bishop e2, d5, castles, knight c6, knight a4, putting pressure on c5, and now queen c2. At some point you just want to do something with your queen, and for example d4, queen c4. I think this is equal for black. I'm not really a big fan of the move queen b3 precisely because of this. So if you're playing black against queen b3, just play the main line with c5, and the queen is basically misplaced, because after a3 you don't take on c3, you don't transpose to the main lines, you force the queen to move again. All right, that's it for the Nimzo-English. So again, personally, choose between queen c2, which is the principled move, and g4, the Zvjaginsev attack. Two very different options, two very different types of positions, and one of them should suit you well. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.